to Chicago Fest. This was before the Blues Fest in Chicago. We used to have Chicago Fest down on Navy Pier. It was when Mayor Jane Byrne was still the mayor. And it was a great festival, and Muddy Waters was playing. Because she wanted to see Muddy Waters, and my brother and I wanted to see Van Halen. Van Halen was big at that time, they were just coming up. But they were playing way too late, and my mom didn't want to stay in the city that late. But Muddy was going on at a fairly decent hour, so we saw Muddy Waters instead, and it was probably just as well because it was way cooler than I could have ever imagined it would be. And we were blown away, my brother and I. My brother was already a lot more into blues than I was. I was like 10 years old, 11 years old then. But we went home and we pretended that we were in the band with Muddy. My mom actually broke out some old 45s that she had of Muddy Waters, and we found out that my mom had this great record collection of old blues. She grew up on the south side of Chicago, and where she grew up, you know, the drinking age, well, back then I'm sure that it was a lot looser, but they didn't live far from the Indian and state line, and they could go across the state line when she was a teenager. My mom was a lot of fun, I guess. She was young. She probably wouldn't mind me saying this. She drove a Corvette. My mom was cool. Yeah. She had platinum blonde hair and drove a Corvette. So they used to go across the state line to the bars where they could smoke and drink when they were younger than they should be, with her sister's older brothers and friends and stuff. And so she saw a lot of guys. She saw, you know, Eddie Taylor and John Brim and all these guys. And I didn't find this out till years later. She was like, "Oh, you like John Brim? Oh, I saw him. What? Yeah. When?" You know, so she's the one that hipped us to it. And then, you know, my brother and I, again, my brother Joe Moss, if anyone doesn't know, Joe is a wonderful guitar player.
Right, Joe Moss
has his own great bands, and he should be on the ship sometime. But we started eventually in our teenage years. He's 3.5 years older than me. Once he could start driving, we started looking for it, and we would skip school, or on a Saturday tell my parents we were going to the movies, but we would go to the city and we would go sit outside, you know, clubs and watch, you know, for bands playing and stuff, or go try to find festivals. But once, you know, I've been this big since I was 16 years old. And my brother was old enough to sneak into bars too, so we started sneaking into the blues jams and seeing, you know, a lot of guys. I saw Ed when I was 17 the first time.
Just last year.
Yeah, just last year. That's right. Just last year. Yeah. And you know, I saw a lot of those guys, and Magic Slim. Magic Slim was one of the first guys to actually get me up on stage because I made the mistake of going, I played too. I played bass, and he got me up to play. Nick, his brother Nick, gave me his bass to play, and I couldn't play shit. But it was a fun experience.
Yeah. We'll go right down the line and come back to Ed. Debbie, you remember the first time you saw the blues live? Some of the live performances by people you'd been listening to on records?
Well, you know, when I was young, it was kind of the British blues invasion, which turned us on to blues. So I saw cats like Janis Joplin and, you know, Jimi Hendrix before I actually saw touring, you know, blues artists. But my folks were musicians, so I was always listening to blues and music, and I guess more jazz in the home growing up, big band. But my dad had a complete collection of Ray Charles records. Now, I didn't really understand divisions of music then, but I knew that that's what I gravitated toward. And then I was very, you know, gravitated toward like John Mayall and Blues Breakers, and kind of felt like, wow, I want to play like Eric Clapton. But that didn't become available for young white girls at that time. But I listened to it a lot, and I don't know, I finally decided that I wanted to do it and play. And so I moved to Northern California, and it turned out that a lot of those Chicago cats, you know, the white players like Muscle White, Bloomfield, Gravenites, they had all moved to that Northern California scene. And all there was this big corridor of music going up and down. So I was living in a little town called Katati, and there was a club called the Inn of the Beginning, which is, wow. But everybody played there. Everybody played there. And I was like sort of pretending to go to college, you know, and working little jobs, but every night I was sitting at this club, and it was Buddy Guy and Junior Wells and Etta James and Albert Collins and Gabe Mel Brown, and it just blew my mind. So I started, you know, trying to play this music and didn't know what the heck I was doing, but I was, you know, watching every night and gathering the records, and back then we just had to kind of try and learn off the records. So I felt like just absorbing it and hearing it. As far as first performances, who really blew my mind, I think was Etta James, because being a woman and that powerful, and she had this thing she did back then where her band was kicking, and she'd take the microphone and just throw it down, and in the middle of singing, and just sing right. You could hear her just as well over the band. And she did a lot of other things too, which I really probably can't even repeat. But that, you know, a big impression. And yeah, and Hendrix, you know, was a blues-based guy, and Clapton was, and it was just that sound. I had to follow it. And then when I was watching all these guys, and then of course Albert Collins was one who came through a lot.
Right? Yeah. Wow. Johnny Rawls.
Oh, yeah.
Take us there. Yeah.
Well, I come up in Mississippi, and we wasn't allowed to really go to clubs. Everybody started in church. And so my first show I saw was the best show, because I'm like 6 or 7, and all the ladies were getting dressed up to go to the concert. Back then they didn't take up money, they didn't pay, they gave an offering. So the gospel group was singing with Sam Cooke and the Soul Stirrers. Oh. So my first concert would be the best and the last I would ever see. And I was blown away by that. And growing up in Mississippi, there was music everywhere, in houses. Music was everywhere, band, blues band, gospel groups, all down the street, everywhere, juke joints. And blacks wasn't playing on the radio, so you became a jukebox star. If your record was on the jukebox, and then there was WLAC in Nashville, Tennessee, the first one to play black music to make you a star was a 150,000 watt radio station that reached all over. And all black people would tune in at 12 midnight to hear WLAC in Nashville, Tennessee. And the children's circuit was a world that you could never imagine or never will see again. There were black clubs, predominantly black clubs, but held like 1,000, 2,000. Even the Club Paradise in Memphis held 3,000 people. And there were predominantly black people, and that was with O.V. Wright, Z.Z. Hill, Lil Johnny Taylor, and it was the best time of my life. And the shows was like a spectacle. Everybody was dressed, the bands wouldn't let the other one outshine them, and it was just something to see. And I didn't start singing until I was 25, because when you would O.V. Wright and Johnny Taylor, why would I open my mouth? So that's what I can say.
Yeah, wow. That's a great picture, John. Thank you. John Hammond. I know you learned a lot off records early on.
Well, when I was 7 years old in 1949, my father brought me to this church in New York where I got to see Big Bill Brunswick. And Big Bill was, he was getting on in age, but he was unbelievable. And I had never seen a blues singer, guitar player before. And it just, I was mesmerized. He was a friend of my father's, and so after the show I was introduced to him, and he shook my hand. I remember my hand felt like a little teeny thing in his huge hand, and he was such a nice guy, but the music was so intense, and I think that affected me for my life. I remember when I was 9 or 10, I saw Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee, and they were just unbelievable. They were so good. It was just pure joy. I became a blues fanatic at that point, and I started buying records. I couldn't get enough, you know. I mean, as I got older, I got to see, well, mostly on the radio on WLAC. I used to tune in every night, and Big Hugh Babe and John R. and they played Howling Wolf and Muddy Waters and Lonesome Sundown and all these guys that just took me out. You know, I couldn't believe it. It was so good. If you liked anything you heard, you could send away to Randy's Record Mart in Gallatin, Tennessee. I probably had a charge account there. I bought so many records in the mail. But I got a guitar when I was 18, and I started playing professionally when I was 19. It was all inside. Wow. Ready to do it.
Great. Albert?
Well, I came from as far away from the source as it gets, Miami, and had no exposure to the blues. I kind of grew up listening to the classic rock players of the day. My uncles played, and they turned me on to Clapton and Hendrix. As I guess most middle class white guys from the suburbs do, you know, they get exposed to it through there. I bought a Clapton album, a live Clapton album, and 90% of the material was blues. He had a Bobby Bland song on there, Otis Rush, a Maceo Merriweather too, and I was like, became very intrigued by it, and I started buying the original versions of these songs, and then I bought a Muddy Waters album in Coral Gables, Florida. It was a cassette. It was Hard Again. That was the record that changed my life. That's when I knew I wanted to be a blues man. And I grew up in the 80s when the music of the day wasn't really very substantive. It was kind of crappy, to be honest with you. It was really bad. It was Kajagoogoo and you know, it was really poppy, sugary crap, and I could not relate to it. And when I discovered the blues, it was the greatest moment of my life. It opened a door for me that I didn't want to close. I loved it so much that that's all I wanted to do was be a blues man, a Chicago blues man. And I got to see Stevie Ray Vaughan. I was 14 or 15 years old. I couldn't get into bars, and my parents wouldn't allow me to. You know, they were the Cleavers, so you know, they wouldn't have any of that. They would take me to concerts. They dropped me off. I went to a lot of concerts by myself because my friends were all into other forms of music. They were into metal and rock, and I went to see Stevie Ray Vaughan by myself. And then I got to, when I got out of high school, as soon as I got out of high school, I started sneaking into bars. I got to see John Lee Hooker at Woody's on the Beach. I went to that show by myself as well. But I didn't care. If you weren't with me, bye. I'm going. You don't need to come with me. Because the music was just so powerful to me, and it didn't matter if I went by myself or not. And then, yeah, that was probably the first one. And then, like, the first time playing at a blues jam, I was just out of high school, and Woody's on the Beach was a club on Miami Beach that was owned by Ron Wood, and Bobby Keys was the band leader running the jam. And I just turned 18, and I came in with my guitar, and the doorman wouldn't let me in, and he said, you can't get in here. How old are you? I'm 18. So you can't get in here. I can't let you in. I said, come on, man, I'm just going to hear the jam. I'm not going to do anything. And I argued with him for about 15 minutes, and finally he said, all right, I'll let you in, but if I catch you drinking, I'm kicking you out. I said, okay, I promise, I won't drink. And so we waited downstairs in the main room there, and Bobby came down and greeted all the jammers and brought us up to the rooftop of Woody's on the Beach. It was this renovated old Art Deco hotel. And up on the rooftop were tubs of beer. And Bobby Keys goes, hey, have a beer. And I said, I really can't, Mr. Keys. The guy downstairs told me I couldn't. He goes, screw that guy, have a beer. And he really put me at ease, and I got to jam with him most of the night, and that was my first taste of what it was like to be a blues guy.